When the Blood Angels got our 10th edition codex, we lost an incredibly iconic unit. Well, okay, we lost more than just one, and okay, there are still Legends datasheets, but you know what I mean. While I too will mourn the old Death Company kit, Gabriel, Seth, and my Sanguinary Priest with Jump Pack, there is one kit that I will miss more than all of those, and that is, of course, the Librarian Dreadnought. But luckily, I happen to have a spare Dreadnought body right here, and I also happen to have way too much time on my hands. Therefore, I say that the Librarian Dreadnought service isn't quite yet over. So, welcome to Gone Hollow Minis. My name is Colt, and today we are reviving the Librarian Dreadnought in glorious Primaris Redemptor Dreadnought scale. Okay, so back before the codex was officially released, I did manage to snag one copy of the Furioso Dreadnought kit, and in a bout of foresight certainly worthy of our Gene Father, I kind of figured that box knots were kind of on the way out. So instead of making any one particular variant, I just kind of cobbled the parts together that I thought looked the coolest and made this guy. The other bits got added to the bits bin and were slowly winnowed down through other projects and kit bashes. Admittedly, this isn't the Firstborn Dread that I've Primarisified. I took the one from the Blood Angels army set and combined it with the bits from the Death Company Dreadnought to make this bad boy. Still yet to be painted, embarrassingly. Perhaps not the most remarkable conversion, but I think the pose really helps to sell the idea, and this one at least has rules. But I've always found the Librarian Dreadnought to be the most interesting of the three. Reading the Mephiston trilogy really brought me around hard on Librarians, and they're one of my favorite subclasses of Space Marines now. And after all, what could be cooler than sticking a vampire space wizard into a Titan and giving it a sword the size of a Space Marine? Not much. But we've got a lot of work to do to make that happen, so let's jump straight into it. The base for this conversion is a Brutalis Dreadnought, but either the Brutalis or the Redemptor could work, with a bit of extra effort. I'm choosing the Brutalis because I want him to be holding his force weapon instead of having it just stuck into his arm. But you can certainly make that work with a Redemptor if that's all you can find. But good luck if you're trying this with the Ballistist, though. A lot of this first part of the build will actually be pretty stock standard, so I'm just going to stick this on in the background and we can talk about what a Librarian Dreadnought really is. The Librarian Dreadnought is a unit that is, as far as I know, completely unique to the Blood Angels. Thanks to Sanguinius' inherent psychic power, the Blood Angels and a lot of their successors show slightly above average psychic aptitude. I mean, you can see this in Chief Librarian Mephiston, someone who I would argue is probably among the strongest mortal psychers in the entire setting, to the point that it gets ridiculous sometimes. But even outside of him, the chapter does just have a lot of rather capable psychers. So, naturally, when one of these psychers falls in battle, it makes sense to inter them within a dreadnought, just as with any other honored brother. The Librarian Dreadnought is different in that it allows the interred librarian to still utilize their psychic abilities. This technology isn't as easy as one might think, and the Blood Angels seem to be the only chapter who uses it in the 41st millennium. There are, however, possible ties to the Thousand Suns Osiren pattern Contemptor Dreadnought. This was a design perfected by Magnus of the Thousand Suns prior to the outbreak of the heresy. It does the exact same thing that the Librarian Dreadnought does, allowing the pilot to continue wizarding from within their own sarcophagus. Magnus did share these plans with his brothers and their legions, but most spurned them and refused to produce any. Perhaps the Blood Angels just kept these patterns bookmarked for all of these years. It's not confirmed, but I could see the 9th being a little bit more accepting of their psychers, at least in this way, so I like to think it's canon. But anyway, back to the Librarian Dreadnought. We have seen a couple of them in novels, but it's kind of rare. The most commonly seen Librarian Dread is Marest, a former chief librarian who was nearly killed while subduing an incredibly powerful, chaos-infused Xenos named the Octo Calvarii. Because of this, Marest was interred into a dreadnought and has chosen to stand guard over the Octo Calvarii, serving as a sentinel to the deepest, darkest corners of the Blood Angels Librarians. Because of this, we've never really seen him in action. He spends most of his time guarding the innermost sanctums of the Carceri Arcanum. And even during the devastation of Baal, I don't remember seeing him in the thick of the fighting. Which is unfortunate, because seeing a walking wizard sarcophagus with an axe the size of a space marine would be cool as hell. There are two other named Librarian Dreadnoughts I can find, but don't get your hopes up. Info on these guys is slim. One, named Galen, is mentioned in White Dwarf 374, taking part in a short narrative mentioned within the magazine. Another, named Zaphalon, much cooler name by the way, is mentioned in the Black Crusade supplement for 7th edition. Taking part in the campaign mentioned in that book. But by this point, we've got some of the bigger chunks of our Brutalis Dreadnought built. These are the pieces that won't be changing all too much, or at least will be built off of instead of omitted. A couple important things are that I'm not going to be including the front armor panels that go around the sarcophagus, and instead will be exposing that section. To do this, make sure not to build the lower hinged armor plate while building the body. We'll cover this up later, so just leave it for now. Also, you can clip off the registration nubs at the waist and hips, allowing you to get more range of motion while posing. There's still plenty of surface contact for glue, and this lets you be a little bit more creative with your pose. Speaking of, we're going to start with the legs first. I have a general idea of the pose that I want, so I have a decent idea of how I want these to sit. Feel free to do this later if you want to experiment some more. While you're thinking of your pose though, keep in mind that one of the feet is molded as all one piece. This gives you a solid connection point to help keep your model nice and stable. I want to go for a kind of stepping forward pose, with the weight being slightly shifted to the left leg. So, having snipped off all of those registration nubs, I can start with the flat foot. Starting with the flat foot lets me build up from a position that I know will be firm on the base, letting me be more creative with the rest of the pose. One other slight modification I made is leaving off the upper thigh armor. Normally, this covers up some holes and unsightly details, but we can leave off these rounded details on the knees to cover them up instead. This part actually looks pretty okay without it, I think, kinda like the joints on the older box knot dread. I also cut away the registration on the front of the thigh, since there's no armor panel to cover it up. Okay, now we can move on to some customization now that our pose is kinda blocked out. Let's start with the torso, since that's kinda the focal point. The first and easiest thing we can do is to swap over the sarcophagus. I've still got a spare from that first Furioso I built, so I'm just going to use that. The sarcophagus lids from the Firstborn and Primaris dreads are actually pretty close, it just takes a little modification. First, obviously, we'll have to separate just the sarcophagus. Next, we need to flatten the back. We're just straight swapping the standard lid for this piece, so we'll need a nice flat connection. You can start by snipping or trimming, but make sure to sand everything flush for a nice even fit. I wasn't as careful as I should have been, so there was a tiny gap. No worries though, I fixed that later with another armor panel from the Librarian Dreadnought kit. Next up are some other details on the side panels. I want to kinda try to recreate the details on the original kit here, at least somewhat. The big chained tome is taken from the Grey Knight Librarian in Terminator armor. This just gets sanded down so the back is flat, and then placed on the armor panel. There's a tiny bit of overhang, but it doesn't bother me all that much. The Librarian Dreadnought kit has a little bit of scroll work beneath this book, but I didn't have a piece that emulated that well. So instead, I cut the wax off of a few purity seals and stuck them to the bottom of the book. It gives the same effect while not trying to recreate the piece one for one. On the other side is a chapter symbol and a little cord with some scrolls attached. I also couldn't find a piece that emulated this as well as I would have liked, so we're going to include a slightly different detail. The chapter symbol is from the newer Blood Angels upgrade sprue, no fuss there. For a bit more interest, I'm going to add this chained banner piece that I believe is from the Skaven Plague Monk kit. I just trimmed this down so that it fit on the armor panel and attached it as normal. This will be a good place for either some careful lettering or a little bit of freehand work. Now on the very back of the Brutalis, there's a cutout for an Iron Hail Heavy Stubber. This, to me, does not seem very librarian, so we'll have to do something different. It starts by using a spare rhino hatch to cover the hole up. You could also use plasticard or any other appropriately sized bit, this was just convenient for me. Then, after looking through some reference images and other people's dreadnought builds, I noticed that the smoke launcher is usually placed here on the old box knot, and I thought that would be a perfect replacement for the Iron Hail. To match the larger size of the Redemptor Dreadnought, I used a smoke launcher from the Baneblade kit. It's a little more interesting and has a little bit more presence on a model this big. For the gap underneath the sarcophagus, where the lower panel usually hinges, start by snipping away at the extra material until the angles are flush. Then, to fill in the gap, we can just use the lower hinge piece, part number 36, and just rotate it a bit and sink it into the hole. You could build up these panels more if you think it still looks out of place, but I've found that I barely notice it personally. But with our torso pretty much taken care of, we can move on to the arms and weapons. Traditionally, a Librarian Dreadnought is equipped with a Force Halberd. GW likes to do this thing where they make things that don't look like halberds and then name them halberds. That is not a halberd. I did try out some other bits to make an actual halberd, like the axe from a Demon Prince, but the Redemptor is just so big that I couldn't get it to look right. So instead, we'll snag a massive Force Sword from the Dread Knight kit. This just got some more Blood Angel-y details added on, and the handle was extended, since the original piece is molded into the hand of a Dread Knight. Now the arms, by far my least favorite part of this arduous kit. Whenever I can, I like to leave my Dreadnoughts posable, but for the Brutalis that sometimes just gets a little bit too annoying to handle. There's just too many finicky joints that constantly come undone even after glue. Maybe it's just a skill issue. I went ahead and built the fists and bolters variant, since I hadn't built that version yet, and I figured it would look better holding onto the sword. For that, I just tacked on the sword with some super glue to get a quick, firm bond, then wrapped each of the fingers around the hilt and held everything in place with plastic cement. The super glue keeps things in place temporarily, while the plastic cement actually holds it all together. I don't expect the super glue to break here, but even if it does, that sword isn't going anywhere. For the other hand, I wanted to do something a little more special. This is a wizard in a box after all, so it makes sense for him to be doing some magic. In building the hand, I worked to make it look like he was doing some kind of magic sign, like the Witcher signs in the Witcher games. A little bit awkward with only 4 fingers, but I think it looks good enough. Then, to cap this whole build off, we're going to add the magic. It starts with a couple pieces of Skaven warpstone. These get glued together to make a solid crystal piece. This will be the projectile that our librarian is conjuring. Next, we can fasten it to our dreadnought's hand using paper clips and wire. Start with a paperclip, straighten it out, and then using a pair of pliers, add a ton of bends along the length. The tighter and more random they are, the better. Then we can fasten these to our magic rock and our dreadnought's fingers by drilling a small hole and using some super glue. I did 3 of these larger gauge lightning bolts attached to 3 fingers to hold the part as firmly as possible. Then went back in with much smaller gauge wire to add more decorative bolts arcing between the larger ones. This will look great painted up, adding a bit of bright green OSL to the contrast with our red dreadnought. But with that final detail added, we can finally see how this whole piece comes together. I am super happy with how this Kitbash turned out. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to recreate the busy, detail-dense look of the original on the larger Redemptor chassis, but I actually think this works really well. The more posable Brutalis kit lets you really lean into the more fluid motions that I think a Librarian Dreadnought would have. Even though all the joints are glued static, I really do think this Dreadnought has a good sense of motion about him. That and the added magic projectile really makes it feel like a Librarian Dreadnought. Overall, this was a really natural conversion that I don't think I could be happier with. Well, I guess maybe if it had an actual halberd. Maybe next time. No, I'm sure you're probably waiting to see this guy painted up, but you have to wait a little bit longer. I have a good reason this time though. To see this walking sarcophagus get his first coats of paint, keep an eye out for the next episode in the Lions of Gorgoth narrative series that I've been producing on the channel. In the meantime, I think he's going to need something to face off with in that story, but that's a Kitbash for another time. If you enjoyed this video and you want to give this Kitbash a shot, make sure to tag me on wherever you share it. I would love to see it. Feel free to drop a like and a comment if you enjoyed, subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss an episode, and until we meet again, friends, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.